Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll just give a few more seconds for attendees to stream in before we begin officially. Okay, I think we shall begin. Good afternoon from Nairobi, everyone, and welcome to this media briefing, during which we will launch the 7th edition of the UN Environment Programme's Adaptation Gap Report. My name is Keisha Rukikaire, and I'm the head of news and media for UNEP. I'll be moderating this event. So each edition of the Adaptation Gap Report provides a science-based assessment of global progress on adaptation planning, financing, and implementation. This year's edition, Too Little, Too Slow, Climate Adaptation Failure Puts the World at Risk, finds that global efforts are not keeping pace with the growing risks that we face. Now, before we get into the substance of the press conference, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines. So our program is 45 minutes long, and we hope to use half that time for questions. We will start with a presentation of the report's main findings by Mr. Henry Neufeld, who is the Chief Scientific Editor of the Adaptation Gap Report, followed by brief remarks by our panel, which will then lead into the media Q&A. Our panelists are in various parts of the world with varying internet strengths, so do bear with us if we should encounter any technical challenges. Our excellent panel today includes Ms. Inge Anderson, Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. We also have Ms. Mami Mizutori, who is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And finally, we'll have Mr. Ovais Sarmad, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. So for media with questions, you'll see a Q&A option in your screen. Please submit your questions in writing in this box. You can begin to submit them straight away, as many of you have already received the report and other materials under embargo. When you submit the questions, please specify your name and the media house that you represent. The session is being recorded and live streamed, and this can be accessed through our website, unep.org, as can all the materials pertaining to this report. Our contact information is also available should you wish to have interviews with the authors and experts following the briefing. Do get in touch. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Henry Neufeld, our Chief Scientific Editor of the report, for his presentation of the main findings. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Keisha. I will now share my screen. Can you see my screen?
We can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to present the key findings of this year's Adaptation Gap Report. The Adaptation Gap Reports provide scientific assessments of the global progress in adaptation in relation to what is perceived to be needed in order to address growing climate risks and to inform international climate change discussions under the UNFCCC. UNEP has produced 6 Adaptation Gap reports since 2014, starting from the run-up to COP20 in Lima. This year's report is the 7th edition in the series. For this report, UNEP convened 27 authors across 21 institutions and from 18 different countries, half of which are in the developing world. The production of the report was overseen by an international steering committee, and it has benefited from 80 external experts reviewing its drafts. In the interest of time, I kindly ask you to refer to the report and the annexes for its guiding questions, methodologies, and data sources. To address the guiding questions, the report looks at adaptation planning, finance, and implementation as proxies for assessing progress in adaptation. This year's report also focuses on evidence of adaptation effectiveness and the interlinkages between adaptation and mitigation. As one can see from the figure, climate risks are strongly accelerating as global warming increases. This has recently been concluded in the IPCC's latest report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. According to the report, the world will face severe climate risks even under low-emission scenarios. This year's devastating flooding in South Asia and severe heat, drought, and fires across multiple regions of the Northern Hemisphere exemplify these mounting climate risks. Therefore, adaptation must take center stage alongside mitigation in the global response to the climate crisis. However, even the best adaptation cannot avoid all losses and damages, and these must therefore be addressed adequately during the coming climate negotiations. Continuous progress is being made in adaptation planning. As the map shows, at least 8 out of 10 countries, 5% more than last year, now have established adaptation plans, strategies, laws, and policies. Moreover, planning instruments are getting better and more inclusive. For instance, more than a third of all parties have quantified and time-bound planning targets, and over 90% of planning instruments consider gender or historically disadvantaged groups. Countries are also increasing the implementability of planning instruments through better objectives, timeframes, climate projections, and stakeholder engagement. However, few instruments capture the outcomes of adaptation actions, such as people or ecosystems being more resilient to climate change, and that still needs to improve. In this map, we can see that more and more countries are including their adaptation finance needs into their nationally determined contributions or national adaptation plans. Their needs are well in line with total adaptation costs in developing countries ranging from 160 to 340 billion by 2030 and 315 to 565 billion by 2050. According to finance providers reporting, international adaptation finance flows reached 29 billion in 2020, the latest year we have information for. Based on these figures, the adaptation finance gap in developing countries is likely 5 to 10 times greater than current international finance flows and continues to widen. Total international climate finance has increased by 4% since 2019. If progress continues at that pace, the 100 billion pledged to developing countries will only be reached in 2025. Doubling of 2019 climate finance flows by 2025, as urged in the Glasgow Climate Pact, therefore requires strong acceleration of support by finance providers to be credible. As the figure shows, the number and volume of adaptation actions continue to rise, although the rate of growth may be slowing, but it is still too early to be sure of the trends and causes. Most actions focus on agriculture, water, ecosystems, and cross-cutting sectors to address rainfall, drought, and flooding. Analysis of the data showed that only 30% of principal adaptation actions explicitly address climate risk reduction, but it is not possible to know how the rest contributes to adaptation. Better reporting would improve our understanding, but considerably more and better action is needed to avoid the implementation gap from widening. This year's report looked specifically at the effectiveness of adaptation and concluded that current adaptation practice is woefully poor. As the figure shows, adaptation actions that lead to positive outcomes are often based on principles of good adaptation practice. Current adaptation actions are largely incremental. They do not consider future climate risk and may lead to maladaptation because of inadequate involvement of stakeholders, lack of attention to local contexts, retrofitting development actions as adaptation, short-term focus, and failing to address social transformation and climate justice. While data on effectiveness and adequacy of adaptation is very limited and urgently needed, the results show that hybrid solutions addressing multiple dimensions of climate risk are typically better than simple solutions. The report was also able to synthesize a few principles of good adaptation practice. Applying those principles to adaptation planning and implementation can ensure that actions are relevant, appropriate, sustainable, equitable, and effective. This year's report also focused on the interlinkages between adaptation and mitigation because of the possible synergies, and to contribute to the Paris Agreement's goal of making climate finance flows more consistent with low-emission, climate-resilient development. Some climate solutions, for example, many nature-based solutions, simultaneously reduce climate risks and contribute to mitigation. These co-benefits can be harnessed if the adaptation mitigation interlinkages are considered from the outset, as this will allow to identify possible barriers and risks and thereby minimize trade-offs. However, current actions addressing adaptation and mitigation jointly still operate mainly in silos and thus miss opportunities to enhance adaptation effectiveness and efficiency. In conclusion, adaptation progress is too little and too slow. While global efforts in adaptation planning, finance, and implementation are increasing, there is no sign of the acceleration needed to keep up with increasing climate risks. And adaptation actions need to get much better. The international community must build on the Glasgow Climate Pact adopted at COP26 last year and deepen commitments on net zero, adaptation, climate finance, and loss and damage at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And strong political will is necessary to avoid climate action from being sidelined because of other major crises. In the name of the authors, the steering committee, and the production team, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Mr. Neufeld. Next, I'd like to invite Ms. Inge Anderson, Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme, to make brief remarks. Over to you, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you very much. And to members of the press, welcome. A multi-year drought in the Horn of Africa has put millions on the brink of starvation. The floods in Pakistan has caused over $30 billion in damages and economic losses. And we're seeing severe summer heat across the Northern Hemisphere, brought on, in addition, destructive and deadly wildfires. These events are inextricably linked to climate change. They are what we are seeing at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, which is how we're living right now. And we aren't going to be staying at 1.1 for long. Policies currently in place, the policies we have right now, will take us to a pathway to 2.8 degree rise by the end of this century, as UNEP's Emissions Gap Report showed when we launched it last week. So we must quickly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and strive for net zero, as we heard my colleague just say. But people, ecosystems, and economies are already suffering. And it will be decades before temperatures start to fall again if we do cut emissions, as indeed we have to. So we must urgently increase efforts to adapt to climate change, to protect and create resilience. UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report 2022, which we're launching here today, tells us that efforts to adapt are not keeping up pace with climate risks and climate impacts. Yet over 80% of countries have at least one national adaptation planning instrument in place, and that we celebrate. Yes, these instruments are increasingly prioritizing the disadvantaged groups, such as women and indigenous people. However, to turn adaptation plans into action, we need funding. And this funding isn't coming through. We're going to need around 160 to 340 billion per year for adaptation by 2030. In 2020, the international adaptation finance flows to developing countries hit 29 billion. This leaves a yawning gap to be filled, around 5 to 10 times the size of adaptation finance that arrived in 2020. So the message of this report is quite clear. Nations need to live up to the Glasgow Climate Pact with strong action, starting at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. We need rapid acceleration in scientific research, in innovative planning, in adequate finance, and in implementation, and deeper international cooperation. As the Secretary General of the United Nations said today, COP27 must provide clear and time-bound roadmap on closing the financing gap for addressing loss and damage. This will be a central litmus test for success for COP27, unquote. Yes, the war in Ukraine, global supply chain shortages, and the COVID-19 pandemic have contributed to energy and food security crisis. Cost of living is going through the roof. Climate adaptation may not seem like a priority right now, but it is. If all commitments are implemented immediately, the reality is that climate change is going to be with us for decades into the future, and the poorest keep paying the price for our inaction. It's therefore imperative that we put time, effort, and resources and planning into adaptation action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. Next, we will hear from Ms. Mami Mizutori, the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Keisha, and good morning to the members of press. Greetings from New York, where we are marking the World Tsunami Awareness Day this week on November 5th. Now, I want to thank Inga for inviting me and delighted to offer my full endorsement of this very important report. Climate change adaptation is a central part of disaster risk reduction. And these two things, adaptation and disaster risk reduction, they are mutually supportive in their objectives, which is to enhance capacity, reduce vulnerability, and build resilience for all but for the most vulnerable groups. And it is not possible to realize the goal of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is to substantially reduce disaster losses by the year 2030 without enhanced investment in adaptation, which we have now heard is woefully lacking. This is because the number and cost of disasters have nearly doubled in the last 20 years because of climate change. And 90% of disasters are caused by climate hazards. This is testament that these disasters will only become larger, more intense, and more frequent if we do not take action. This is why we support the call made by this report for increased political commitment and increased funding to adaptation as the equal half to climate mitigation. One of the main messages I will be carrying to COP next week is to create a future with zero climate disasters. Now, as ambitious as this may sound, it is possible to do this if countries commit to reducing climate vulnerability and exposure. This requires adopting what we call a comprehensive risk management approach. This is a holistic approach considering the intersection of climate risks, current and future, and all other disaster risks, in particular, the vulnerabilities that exist in our societies. If we can adopt this holistic approach and double down our efforts in reducing vulnerabilities in our societies, including poverty, gender inequality, we can stop disasters from devastating lives and livelihoods. I also want to highlight the importance of early warning systems as a very strong instrument for both adaptation and disaster risk management. Last month, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, my office, and WMO, we jointly launched a global status report on early warning systems, and I'm pleased to inform you that the action plan for the Early Warning for All initiative of the UN Secretary General, led by WMO in partnership with UNDRR, this action plan will be launched at COP next week. Finally, if the parties at this COP can agree to set the mechanisms by which developing countries can receive valuable technical assistance to enhance their capacity to avert, minimize, and address losses and damages by climate-related disasters through the Santiago Network, then these countries will be able to more effectively act against current and future disaster risks. This report is a clear call to action for all who care about reducing future losses and damages. And we can create a world with zero climate disasters, but this will require a collective, strong commitment and close cooperation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ms. Mizutori. So just a reminder to media colleagues that you can start sending your questions in now through the Q&A box so that we can start to queue them up. Our final speaker is Mr. Ovais Sarmad, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mr. Sarmad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. And thanks to Inga and other colleagues who have spoken before me. And at the outset, I'd like to agree with all that they have said and emphasize the importance of it. And from our side, we are in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27, and in 3 days' time, there will be the official opening of COP27, and the eyes of the world will be here in addressing the existential threat that we are all facing and have to address. In that context, the timely publication of the Emissions Gap Report by UNEP is extremely important. We very much welcome it, and not just the report, but the message it conveys, which is very loud and clear. As far as adaptation is concerned, as was also mentioned by Henry, it's too little, too slow in coming. And that links very clearly to the demands by many countries around the world who are facing the impact of climate change in many, many parts of the world, and they need to adapt. And in doing so, the most important thing is, as was said, finance, and that is also not coming through as it should, as was promised. And it would be, as Inger said, a litmus test here at COP27 on that particular aspect of negotiations, where the finance, and not just finance, let me add, together with finance, the technological advancement and transfer of technology and capacity building for the communities and countries to be able to utilize the finance when it is made available is also it's incumbent upon the international community to make sure that that happens, and that happens in a very timely and urgent fashion. So once again, here in COP, those issues will be taken up, and we're already preparing, we're already meeting with different negotiating groups, and those items that I just mentioned are on the agenda and on top of the agenda. So we expect a positive and hopefully a good outcome at the end of the COP, but still a lot of work that still needs to be done. In that context, we in UNFCCC published our own synthesis report of the NDCs, and that also points to us the same direction, that countries are not on track in line with the targets and goals of Paris Agreement. In fact, they're far away from those commitments that have been made. So very significant transformative action and decisions will need to be made here in the COP in the coming couple of weeks. So all hands are on deck, and our new Executive Secretary, Simon, unfortunately he couldn't be here. He asked me to convey his full support to all of you in addressing what we're trying to do in advancing in the various aspects of climate change negotiations, be it mitigation, adaptation, finance, transparency, and not to mention the loss and damage, which would also be an extremely important aspect of the outcome here in Sharm el-Sheikh. So back to you, Keisha. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Samad, and thank you, Mr. Neufeld, and all our panelists. We will move straight into the Q&A portion of the briefing right now. I have a couple of questions that came ahead of the briefing, so I'll start with those. The first one I have, I think, may be for you, Ms. Anderson, and it is says those least responsible for climate change are paying the highest price. Would you say there are links between climate justice and adaptation, and specifically adaptation financing, which the report finds is woefully inadequate?
Absolutely, yes. Climate injustice is what any person who lives in Pakistan will tell you they're suffering right now. Climate injustice is what any one of the 1.5 million people who are displaced in Nigeria from the floods would be telling you they're living in. Climate injustice is what we are seeing here I speak to you from Kenya. We are in the 4th year of drought, a drought that is caused in part certainly by climate change and by shifting of our climate in significant impacting, therefore, harvests and people's abilities to sustain themselves. 2.5 million cattle have died in Kenya as we speak, just this season. So yes, there's an absolute linkage between justice or injustice, if you like, and the adaptation agenda. And the more and the longer we delay on the mitigation side, the higher the bill will pay. And no one is immune from these impacts. Countries are interdependent. Not only should global solidarity make it obvious that monies have to be on the table, not only should the Paris Accord make it obvious that monies have been promised, not only should the fact that these emissions are not caused by the countries that are suffering the most cause money to the table, but monies need to be on the table because we are interdependent and because this is the only way that we can protect and prevent the most extreme catastrophic impacts of the climate climate changes we're seeing now. As I said, we're already at 1.1 degree, and we are heading to 2.8 with current policies. We need to bring that down urgently on the mitigation side. Meanwhile, we need to invest in adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one for Mr. Sarmad from Jamil Chade, a Brazilian journalist for UAL News, who says, President Lula will be in Egypt. What do you expect from the new Brazilian government, and how can Brazil contribute after years of record deforestation?
Thank you. And we welcome the outcome in the elections in Brazil, and looking forward to welcoming Mr. Lula, President-elect Mr. Lula, to Sharm el-Sheikh. And this is an important change that we have seen at the political level that should send a very strong signal with regard to deforestation that we've been experiencing in many parts of the world, in particular in the Amazon. And forests, as we know, are the biggest sinks that have the potential and capacity to absorb the carbon emissions that are generated. So this is an important, very welcome outcome, and we will be working with all parties. And Brazil is an extremely important player in especially the forest area and the preservation of forests, including vast areas that cover the Amazonian forest and for that matter, in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sarmad. We have a question here for Ms. Mizutori. We are already seeing impacts of climate change in the form of disasters like droughts and floods and wildfires. What do global trends look like for disasters in the coming years, and how would you gauge our ability to manage them? And also, what is the role of adaptation in managing them?
Well, thank you very much for that question. So if we first look at the past trend, as I mentioned, in the past 20 years, the number of major disasters have doubled and the cost has tripled. Now, of course, we're not including in this yet the climate carnage that the Secretary General described, the floods in Pakistan. So I'm afraid that the numbers are much worse. If we look at the future, this April, we launched a Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction 2022. And in here, we predict UNDRR, using the data we have, that in 2015, there were 400 medium to major disasters a year. But if we continue in the current trajectory of, let's say, inaction of climate, then this number will become 560 a year in 2030. This is 1.5 medium to major disaster per day globally. And this is a terrible forecast, but I'm afraid that that is what the data tells us. What can we do? Indeed, we need to manage better climate risk and all other disaster risks. I mentioned about the hashtag Zero Climate Disasters, the campaign that we will take to Sharm. There are 5 components of this. The first is we need political will, enhanced political will for both mitigation and adaptation. The second is we need what I mentioned as comprehensive risk management, which is to bring together the climate risk management through national adaptation plans, which include disaster risks such as vulnerability exposure, but also integrate these with the disaster risk management strategies, which sometimes lack the future climate risks in them. So this is what we call bringing together the two and have a comprehensive risk management approach. The third thing we need to do is we need to double down on reducing vulnerability, poverty, inequality, because if we can't do that, disasters will continue to devastate. The fourth thing is more local action, because that is where the resilience is most needed. Local communities need to be resilient with their own solutions. And fifth, finally, early warning system. Now, mortality from climate-related risk has been rather stable or even going down because of early warning systems. So we need to enhance our efforts on this. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ms. Mizratori. We have a question from Radio France International. To what extent are the adaptation measures or national plans too poor? Could you please give some concrete examples? I think this might be one for you, Mr. Neufeld.
Yes, thank you, Keisha. That's an important question, of course. And we've seen all these recent devastating impacts of climate change and climate variability. And they tell us that the actions that countries are taking often are not sufficient to address these disasters that Mizratori has just talked about. And at the same time, I think it's very clear that heat action plans, for instance, they reduce effectively the exposure and the risks that people face when hit by a heat wave. And the introduction of early warning systems in Bangladesh has reduced the number of fatalities due to these cyclones by thousands in a very few numbers of years. So what I'm trying to say is that the effects can be reduced significantly through the right actions, and that more countries now need to address and develop their national adaptation plans in order to have these responses ready. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We have one from our live YouTube stream, which says, what lessons can be drawn from this report for the efforts to plan and implement private sector adaptation actions, especially in the Global South? Ms. Anderson, is that something you would like to address?
Sure, happy to. Look, I mean, obviously, protecting a city, protecting communal infrastructure will have to be something that's undertaking more broadly. And here, bonds and instruments such of this nature can be important. But we need to understand that there is much private sector infrastructure that is also heavily exposed, and it would be in their strong interests to use adaptation measures to make those protection efforts. And many look at and say, well, insurance schemes will be the way to go. And yes, for a while they will. But if we do not bring down the temperature rises, then insurance will become unaffordable. The reality is the premiums will go up so high that no one would be able to take that insurance. But we are seeing, and this is very interesting, but it's small scale, coastal infrastructure, tourism infrastructure, investing in coastal restoration to protect their infrastructure, right? We're seeing those kind of investments already happening, which of course we celebrate. We're seeing cities using the low-lying areas within cities in the developing countries as floodplains. But we have to be very mindful that often it is the lowest lying, the most precarious settings in cities that are also those where the poorest live, often in slum-like conditions. So finding the justice dimension in this is critical. But yes, private sector has an opportunity to step up. And frankly, it's in their self-interest to do so, to protect what they have invested in. But it will need better government planning, and this is what this report bears out. It will need to have an assessment of where the highest exposure is so that countries can direct private sector to make these investments. But we all know that if we want to stress test a banking sector, and that banking sector has considerable lending out to, for example, the tourism sector, and the tourism sector takes a massive hit from a disaster, then not only is the tourism sector hit, but the economy sector is hit because the banking sector is hit. So we need to understand that it is very much in the sense of creating resilience to the kind of disasters that Ms. Misatori is mentioning, that we can create that is when we adapt. We also have and create the resilience to climate change and to disasters. And that is where the private sector needs to lean in more and engage with governments to make these promises real.
Thanks very much, Ms. Anderson. We have a question, I think, for you, Mr. Neufeld. It says, in the report, you mentioned that developed countries missed their 100 billion pledge by 17 billion. However, Oxfam published a report a few days earlier saying that countries may have cheated on their funding and paid significantly less money, only about 25 billion. Does this mean that the funding gap could actually be much higher?
If that were the conclusion, then indeed the finance gap would be higher. We take the OECD DAC data as our basis, and that's where these 29 billion come from, and also the 79 billion sort of to explain the shortfall with the 100 billion pledge, which includes adaptation and mitigation. And it's restricted, of course, to international climate finance. Now, some of that money, and we don't know how much, but certainly a significant proportion is not actually adaptation or mitigation. It's repurposed. And therefore, some of these claims are certainly correct. And we simply cannot say exactly how the values are. We need better reporting to be able to make better distinctions here. So we're going with the data we have, and it's clear that some of those that information is not correct. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ms. Anderson to perhaps add something.
I'll just add, and I very much endorse what Mr. Neufeld just said, but just the cost of these disasters, the cost of inaction is so very high. And maybe just to highlight that Governor Rubio of Florida, after an absolutely catastrophic storm that hit Florida, and our sympathies with the citizens there, asked for some $35 billion in emergency support. This is one state in the United States. Important. So when we think that only 29 or 25 billion has gone into adaptation investments, as per this report, or whatever other number others may, although we stand by ours, but it's just so wholly inadequate. And that is why in Glasgow, there was this promise to double. And that is why on our way to Sharm, we have to reiterate that promise on doubling, because the financing has to be on the table to sustain and support the very poorest.
Thank you very much. We have a question for Ms. Misatori. I think we're drawing to the end of this briefing. One second. Okay, we have, you mentioned early warning as a key climate adaptation method. What are the current problems with warning systems?
So we have a problem about the coverage first. Only half of the world, half of the countries have early warning system. Less than 50%, around 40% of the LDCs have early warning. 1/3 of the SIDS only have early warning. So this is, to start with, a big problem, but it's not only the numbers. The quality of early warning system has to be improved, enhanced, because early warning system is not only about forecasting and transmitting warnings. It starts with robust risk information and needs to end to reach the last mile, meaning that the most vulnerable people are prepared to take early action when early warning is issued. And this is not the case yet. And this is what the Secretary General is aiming to change, that not only there is a coverage of early warning system for all, but it's multi-hazard and it's end-to-end, so that when we say no one is not covered, we're talking also about the most vulnerable people. This is the current problem, and we're going to fix it in 5 years.
Many thanks. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is really all the time we have. I'd like to end by thanking our panelists for lending us their expertise and for our media colleagues for making the time to cover this report during what is clearly a very busy period on the climate calendar. Should you have questions, we remain available. Do get in touch. Thanks very much and have a great afternoon, morning, evening.
You disconnect?